During my career as an Army Special Forces officer, I received a significant amount of training on how to plan military operations, and I had countless opportunities to plan military operations and missions. I even taught variations of the military decision-making process in 8 different countries. I've helped write 100-page operations orders that took a week to produce, but I've also held a map and imagery onto the nose of a helicopter, and I briefed pilots and a Special Forces team using my pencil as a pointer. It all depends on the amount of time you have and the quality and competence of your teammates. Let's take a look at military planning, which uses what is affectionately known as the military decision-making process, or MDMP. We will discuss the 7 steps of MDMP, their substeps, and throughout this video I will walk you through a sample planning cycle for a conventional Army military mission. Military planning is an art and a science, and while I love the art of planning, the doctrine and steps of the MDMP are for sure the science of military planning. I've said it many times before, that before you can think outside the box, you need to know and master what's inside the box. Knowing and mastering the steps of the MDMP process is something which I would say is mandatory in the box knowledge. I'm going to make a future video about how to plan like special operations. Let's say this is an outside of the box variation of the MDMP process. But this video is going to be MDMP and nothing but MDMP, which is inside the box. Let's start with a quick overview of the 7 steps. There's 7 steps in MDMP. The first is to receive the mission. This is when you get an order from higher headquarters telling you what to do. Step 2 is mission analysis. This is where the planning staff gathers all of the required information to make a good plan. Think of this as research and situational analysis. Next, the battalion staff makes a plan. But in the military, we don't call it a plan, as in Plan A or Plan B. We call it a course of action, or a COA. Step 3 is COA development. Step 4 is COA analysis. This is where you analyze or wargame a plan to make sure that it works. Step 5 is COA comparison. As its name implies, this is where you compare COAs to assess their strengths and weaknesses. Step 6 is COA approval. This is where the staff takes the results of the COA comparison and presents them to the commander for his decision. Step number 7 is orders production. This is where the staff writes the operations order, or op order, and gives it verbally, electronically, or in person during an op order brief. Now that we've done a quick overview of the 7 steps of MDMP, let's take a look at each of these steps in greater detail. But since the best unit that I ever saw at Inside the Box MDMP planning was the 2nd of the 50 Deuce Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault, we will look at MDMP from the perspective of an infantry officer on staff in the battalion headquarters. As soon as you receive the mission, you need to alert the staff. Let's say, for example, that the 2nd Brigade staff of the 101st Airborne Division issues us an order that mandates that we occupy a hilltop number 47, designated Objective Diamond, no later than 3 nights from now. Next, the staff would get some initial guidance from the commander. The commander takes a look at the hilltop using maps and imagery, and he combines his experience, education, and training and intuition into initial guidance to the subordinate commanders. He will also give guidance on when to initiate movement to a staging area to be ready to go. It could be a patch of earth from which the infantry will begin patrolling as they move on foot to Objective Diamond. But this could be a staging area prior to donning parachutes and jumping in. Or it could be a pickup zone or PZ location to prepare for an air assault. Next, the planning staff will issue a warning order to their subordinate units. The staff then writes a 1-page order called a warning order, or WARNO, which alerts the subordinate company commanders that 3 nights from now that they are going to assault an enemy position on a hilltop several miles from here. Mission analysis helps the staff and commander more holistically understand the complexity of the situation and what must be done to accomplish the mission. Mission analysis has 18 substeps. The first is analyze the higher headquarters plan in order. This is where the battalion staff would look at the order they received and deliberately look for tasks, coordinating instructions, timelines, and guidelines. Next, we perform the initial intelligence preparation of the battlefield, or IPB. This is done by the military intelligence team, and it involves defining the operational environment. For example, they would discuss the weather and terrain and how the local people support the initiatives of the U.S. government. They would describe the environmental effects on operations. This would be a discussion of how the terrain and support of the people might influence different types of missions in the area. Then they would evaluate the threat. This is an analysis of the capability and disposition of enemy forces. And then they would determine threat COAs. If you remember from a few minutes ago, a course of action is just a military version of a plan. During this step of IPB, the intelligence staff will make an estimate of what the enemy is most likely to do, which is called the most likely course of action, and what the enemy could do that would hurt the friendly forces the most, and this is called the most dangerous course of action. Step 3 of mission analysis is to determine specified, implied, and essential tasks. Here, each staff section identifies tasks specified to them in the higher headquarters order and tasks that are implied. By the end of the MDMP process, every task on this list must be addressed. A specified task might be to secure Objective Diamond, but an implied task is to provide medical care and casualty evacuation support for the soldiers injured during the mission. Step 4 is to review assets available and to identify resource shortfalls. In our situation, the battle staff know that they have 3 organic infantry companies and a motorized infantry company and a headquarters company. They might identify that they need tanks or engineers. Now would be the time to request additional support or enablers. Next, the staff members would determine constraints. This is where the MDMP nerds like to argue about constraints and limitations. Step number 6 is to identify facts and develop assumptions. For example, the order says that U.S. forces are not allowed any collateral damage. This is a constraint, but the implication is that we cannot use artillery to set the conditions if the scouts identify non-combatives on Objective Diamond. Next, the brigade staff begins risk assessment and management. I've made a great video which already describes military risk management, and then I further refine that process into a technique that I teach to MBA students, small business leaders, and my cybersecurity students, which is called Anticipate Mitigate. Anticipate the threats and find ways and assign assets to mitigate each of those threats. The next step is to develop CCIR, which stands for the Commander's Critical Information Requirements. This is further broken down into 3 subgroups. Priority Information Requirements, or PIR, is an information requirement for intelligence support. An example could be the location and number of enemy forces. Friendly Forces Information Requirements, or FFIR, are what the commander needs to know about friendly forces. For example, a commander will want to know if there's a friendly KIA, killed in action, or how long it takes to fly from the objective to the field hospital. Essential Elements of Friendly Information, EEFI, identify those elements of friendly force information that, if compromised, would jeopardize mission success. An example of EEFI would be if the enemy learned what time and where the air assault PZ will be. The next mission analysis step is to develop the initial information collection plan. This is where the military intelligence staff identifies what else they need to know, and then they can send out scout teams, or Intel Surveillance and Reconnaissance, ISR, or Unmanned Aerial Vehicles, UAVs. The next step is to update the planning timeline. I always recommend that a unit makes 3 timelines. The first timeline is the operation timeline. This is how the mission will go down. The second is the enemy timeline. This is what the enemy is doing at any given point in time. And the third is the planning timeline. This is how the staff and commanders will use the time available to plan and rehearse up until they load their helicopters. Next, the staff develops a proposed problem statement. The problem statement is the description of the primary issue or issues that impede commanders from achieving their desired end state. Step 12 is to develop a proposed mission statement. A mission statement includes the 5 W's. For example, the 2nd of the 50 Deuce Parachute Infantry Regiment Air Assault will seize Hilltop 66, Objective Diamond, at Delta Golf, Niner 5 Tree 7, 4 Tree 2 Niner, not later than D-Day, H+6, 1 August 2024, in order to allow the Rakkasan Brigade to establish a forward arming and refueling point, or FARP, and prepare for follow-on operations. The next step is to develop and issue initial commander's intent. The executive officer or chief of staff will take lead in writing and recommending a proposed commander's intent. The commander's intent usually addresses key tasks and the desired end state in reference to friendly forces, the enemy forces, and the terrain. Next is the mission analysis brief. The staff then gathers all the information from the previous steps and briefs it to the commander in what is called the mission analysis brief. I always recommend rehearsing any brief before giving it to the commander. Step 15 is to develop course of action evaluation criteria. In the next few minutes, the staff will begin making Plan A and Plan B and Plan C. Again, those are called courses of action. The commander will announce the criteria that he will use to evaluate those COAs. These criteria could be the number of expected casualties, or the speed, or the opportunity to maneuver, risks, logistical supportability, force protection, timing, political considerations, or a dozen of any other criteria that he wants to use. Step number 16 is to develop the warning order. The staff will then begin writing the warning order. Step number 17 is to develop and issue planning guidance. The commander and executive officer will issue planning guidance. And the last step of the mission analysis is to issue a warning order. It is usually sent out electronically. The battalion staff then moves on to step 3, COA development. Course of action development is where the staff develops options for Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. Often the planning staff is given some guidance and then broken into smaller teams to develop the different COAs. Each COA must be suitable, feasible, acceptable, distinguishable from one another, and complete. For each COA, the staff will assess relative combat power. This is when they take the enemy composition and disposition, and then they array and assign forces to destroy or to mitigate them. In our situation, we have an enemy platoon on the north, one on the south, and one in the east. We will array one organic infantry company to destroy each enemy platoon. The staff will also assign headquarters and prepare a statement and sketches. The final part of COA development is to brief the different courses of action to the commander, but sometimes to the executive officer or chief of staff. After this briefing, the commander will choose his favorite courses of action and/or give some guidance about modifying a COA. And this takes us to the next step, which is analyzing courses of action. Course of action analysis is known as wargaming. I never liked that name because war is terrible, and for sure it's not a game. Nonetheless, wargaming is a systematic look at what is likely to happen for any given course of action. The best war games I've ever seen are done using a map or a sand table. The results are recorded in a matrix which can be used later in the planning and execution process. For the sake of our example, our war game is going to be broken into 4 phases. The first phase is the infiltration, starting at PZ posture and ending with the first boots on the ground. The second phase is the actions on the objective. The third phase is providing security to Objective Diamond while the Aviation Brigade sets up their Forward Arming and Refueling Point, FARP. Phase 4 is when the Rakkasans arrive and stage out of Objective Diamond for their follow-on mission. Participants should sit down or stand in the order in which they brief, in accordance with the briefing order listed in the Wargaming Matrix. The S2 or Military Intelligence Officer in charge will brief the enemy forces and what they will do during each phase of the operation. The S2 Military Intelligence Sergeant will brief what the local populace will do. One of the staff officers will brief for each of the maneuver companies. The medical platoon leader will brief the medical plan. The S4 Logistics Officer will brief the Admin and Logistics Operations Center, or ALOC. The Artillery Officer will brief fires. The S3 Air will brief close air support, and the S6 will brief command and control. Let's do a few very simplified and very quick rounds of wargaming. During Phase 1 infiltration, most likely the enemy will be asleep, with minimal manning on the objective. The local populace will also be asleep. Alpha Company will be in PZ posture, Chalk 1. Bravo Company is Chalk 2. Charlie is Chalk 3. Delta is Chalk 1. And the Battalion Aid Station and the Logistics Team are Chalk 3. The Division Artillery will set the conditions with some suppression of the enemy air defense, or seed fires. 4 Apaches will provide close air support, and the Battalion Commander and S3 will provide command and control from the C2 helicopter in Chalk 4. For the next phase of wargaming, the Intel Officer will brief that the enemy forces are surprised by the artillery and close air support, and are heavily attrited while defending their positions. The local populace are awakened by the explosions and the sounds of the helicopter, and they begin to panic and to flood the cell phone lines and internet. Alpha Company fires and maneuvers to seize Objective North. Bravo seizes Objective East, and Charlie Company seizes Objective South. Delta Company patrols up and down the ingress and egress routes vicinity Objective Diamond to destroy fleeing enemy forces. The medics set up the Battalion Aid Station in the southwest corner of the landing zone, or LZ, and the ALOC, or Admin Logistics Operations Center, sets up right next door. As soon as the first helicopters get on station, Davardi is lifted, but the Apaches are firing and engaging and destroying enemy personnel all over Objective Diamond. C2 is in a Restricted Operating Zone, or ROZ, a few thousand feet above Objective Diamond. Once the battalion moves to Phase 3, the enemy forces on Objective Diamond are destroyed, but they are trying to get organized for the counterattack. The locals are no longer afraid but are curious and trying to reach the hilltop to find out what happened. Alpha Company will secure the north perimeter of Objective Diamond. Bravo Company will secure the east and the south, and Charlie the west. Delta Company patrols the roads in vicinity of Objective Diamond and is prepared to engage a counterattack. The aid station continues to treat and evacuate casualties, while the ALOC runs resupply bundles to the different company command posts. Davardi is off station as well as the Apaches, and the battalion establishes a jump talk or tactical operations center vicinity Objective North. As you can see, wargaming is a good way to figure out what will or could happen during the various phases of the operation. The next step of the MDMP process is course of action comparison, which is exactly what the name implies, comparing and evaluating the different courses of action. Using the evaluation criteria given during the mission analysis, a commander may use a decision support matrix to decide which course of action they will use. For example, to oversimplify, we have 3 unique courses of action. COA 1 is to patrol in, COA 2 is to jump in, and COA 3 is to conduct an air assault. The colonel said that he will be evaluating the COAs based upon surprise, violence of action, logistical resupply, harm to civilians, and simplicity. Jumping makes the biggest surprise. Then comes the air assault, and last is patrolling to the objective. The jump will be less violent because once the first aircraft is approximately over the objective, we will need to lift fires and close air support, whereby rotary wing assets can provide close air support to enable infantrymen on the ground in the other courses of action. Patrolling requires the most logistical support, while resupply can be flown and/or dropped alongside the infantry when they infiltrate the objective areas. We are much more likely to find and get engaged by anti-coalition locals if we walk in. Working with the Air Force is always problematic, but infantry can always walk, and the brigade has dedicated aircraft from the 101st Aviation Brigade. All in all, the air assault is the lowest score, and so it's chosen as the best course of action. COA comparison ends when the staff gives a COA comparison brief to the commander. Sometimes this is formal, and other times it's informal. Once the commander has received this formal or informal course of action comparison brief, he makes a decision about what COA the unit will do. Sometimes he just chooses a specific COA, but other times he will take the best parts of each COA and put them together. Once he's made a decision and approved the COA, it's time for the staff to begin producing the order. Orders production is simply writing up the operation order and disseminating it to the subordinate commanders. When there's plenty of time, a staff is able to write an entire order and give an operations order brief. But in a time-constrained environment, the staff only has time to make a few key products, and the plan is verbally briefed to commanders. Military planning is an art and science. The science is useful when you have the time to deliberately and systematically set the conditions for success. The art is useful when you need to get the bad guys and just make it happen. Okay, so there you have it, an overview of the military decision-making process, affectionately known as MDMP. What do you think is the most important step of the military planning process? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to join my Life as a Special Operations team, and to forward this video to a friend who needs to see it. Life is a special operation. Are you ready for it?